Hi guys, welcome to the Classist Corner. I'm Kat, and this week I'm going to be talking about the season finale of Troy Fall of a City, episode 8, Offering. Now, before I get into the main chunk of the episode, I just have to say thank you to everyone who sort of joined me when I've been talking about this series. It's unusual that I get to talk about something that's sort of ongoing, and I've had such an amazing response from people. But in the comments, I've had like nearly 100 new subscribers since I started talking about this. So I just want to say thank you so much, and I'm really glad that so many people have watched or sort of found my channel because of this series. Now, I will be talking about this episode a little bit weirdly compared to some of the others, because really there's just sort of one major theme of this episode, which is the sacking of Troy. Now, we knew potentially that this was coming at the end, the last episode of Troy Fall of a City, the city of Troy would fall. So I'm going to be more talking about specific characters and themes rather than sort of the episode as a whole overall. Also in this episode, the text that I'd probably be referencing the most is Virgil's Aeneid, specifically Book 2, where Aeneas recounts his experience during the sacking of Troy to the character of Dido. So there are quite a few other texts that deal with the fallout of the Trojan War. There's descriptions in the Odyssey, obviously tragedies like the Trojan women, Hecabe, Ajax. They all sort of deal with the fallout of it. There is, I think it's Quintus Cerealis is the fall of Troy. He has an account, but the fullest account of the actual sacking of Troy itself that I am familiar with is Aeneid Book 2. If there are any other accounts or texts that you guys would like to talk about that I haven't mentioned, please comment down below, as always. So first off, I'm going to talk about the Trojan horse. Now obviously with the Trojan myth, the Trojan horse is such an iconic image. It's the Trojan horse. How ubiquitous can you get on that one? So and there's a lot of different descriptions of it. In the Aeneid it's described as mountainous, big thing, very big, which you don't really see in Troy Fall of a City. The Trojan horse is quite small. It doesn't have sort of a huge amount of Greek soldiers in it. There's only one or two. And I think it's very decorative. It's a very, very cool Trojan horse, but it's a really cool looking horse. Again, it's not as big. It's described as an offering to Poseidon, which I think a lot accounts differ on that one. In some texts, such as I think it's Odyssey, that says it's a gift to Poseidon in Odyssey, and then in Aeneid it's a gift to Athena. The lie that they come up with, the Greeks come up with to get the Trojans to take it in. So it is very small, it's very decorative. It only has, in the show, it only has Odysseus and Menelaus hidden inside it, as opposed to the wealth of Greek soldiers, which makes sense, because in the show, Paris sort of stabs it with a spear and a load of grain comes out, and that's one of the reasons that the show has had for them bringing it into the city, is that throughout the show there's been issues with the grain in the city, so having the Trojan horse filled with grain is another reason to bring it in, despite people like Cassandra's warnings. Now, in Aeneid Book 2, like I said, this is one of the most complete accounts that we have, the extant accounts that we have. Although it is from a Roman source, it's from quite late. This is obviously in the reign of Augustus Caesar, so, it's in the 1st century AD, so it's sort of later on, antiquity-wise. Not very late on, but still, later than the Odyssey. So that account, it has a character called Laocoon. He is a priest of Poseidon, I feel like. In Troy, he says, no, this is clearly a trap, and he throws a spear at the horse, and it sort of digs in and nothing really comes out. And then the gods decide, oh no, he's messing up fate. So they take a giant sea serpent, rises from the sea, strangles Laocoon and his 2 sons, and then the Trojans go, well, that happened, and then they bring the horse into the city anyway. With Aeneas sort of looking there like, oh, this is suspicious. because Aeneas in the Aeneid is very clever, supposedly. So Aeneas in this doesn't really get that much to do. He is there, but he's not on looking with any particular significance as opposed to more than any other character. So they like in all versions of the myth, the Trojans bring the horse into the city, the gates are opened. I'll talk more about the reasons in the show, why later, and the Greek forces flood in. So going on to that, when the sacking of the city really starts, there are a few things. Like, I feel like a few characters really do get significant changes from textual counterparts. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Priam and Hecabe. This is basically going to be me talking about lots of people's deaths, because in a few versions of many different things with Priam is typically described, again in the Aeneid, and I think also described in the Trojan Women in one of the choruses, right below down if I'm wrong, where Priam is described as dying, sort of clinging to an altar in Troy and sort of begging for his life, and sort of, you know, it's quite a sad scene. And then in many different texts, most prominently the Aeneid, it is Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, or Neoptolemus, who actually kills Priam, and it's meant to be to show that, and in especially the later text, the Roman texts, it's meant to show how awful the Greeks are, and how awful Pyrrhus is, that he would kill a defenseless old man clinging to an altar. That's sort of a taboo thing to do. It's also notable to say that Priam, of all accounts, Priam in text is a lot older than Priam is shown in the show. David Threlfall is, you know, he is an older man, you know, but he hasn't fathered 50 sons in his life. He's not as old as he is as the textual counterpart. But in the show now, what they do is Priam has quite a noble death. He is standing, he's holding a sword, and he tries to fight Agamemnon, and Agamemnon kills him. And so they sort of made the man cowering from his life on an altar as almost a sacrificial sign of the fall of Troy, to sort of a king dying proudly with his city. And I think that's maybe to make him a more heroic figure for a modern audience. Now, I'll talk about more of the reactions of modern audiences later, but so there's that. And then you have Hecabe's death. Now, Hecabe is a interesting figure in text a lot of ways, because, you know, she's the noble queen of Troy, but then in later texts, especially the tragedy Hecabe, which I recommend everyone read, it's a very good tragedy, you see cracks forming in the idea of, you know, the degradation of one day she's a queen and the next day she's a slave, and all these horrible things that happen to her children, and that even a noble woman can go essentially rabid, because there's a lot of imagery with dogs with Hecabe, and in some versions of the myth she actually turns into a dog because of her anger and grief, and the gods change her, and the metamorphosis by Ovid, there's a sort of account of this. So in the show, after Priam dies, she slits her wrists and she dies on her bed, which would, you know, that does make sense, but again, I feel like it's a change for the modern audience. You don't really want to see Hecabe taken as a slave, and you don't want, maybe they don't have time, because this is the finale, this is the last episode, and I don't know, they're not going to do a sequel series as far as I'm aware. I will talk more about the potential of a sequel series later. So with Hecabe, she slits her wrists rather than tried to protect her potentially living children. Like I said in the first episode, the number of children Priam and Hecabe have has been like cut to like 4 or 5. Yeah, you have Hector, Paris, Troilus, Deiphobus and Cassandra. So you have 5 as opposed to like 25. So she has a lot of kids. So she doesn't have Polyxena, her youngest daughter, and she doesn't have a youngest son, in which they're the people who really, it's their deaths that really drive her over the edge and make her start gouging people's eyes out, which is a thing that happens. So, but she gets sort of a quieter death, and I think that is for a modern audience. Or maybe it's for a shock factor, I don't know. So then you have the 3 other women that's been prominent in the show. You have Cassandra, who obviously it has been throughout, you know, prophesizing doom. It's not been very explicit, she just sort of has, that is a factor of the myth in terms of she makes a statement, and then people don't believe her. That's a key part of being Cassandra. She isn't present in the Aeneid with the scene with the Trojan horse. Like I said, she sort of replaces Laocoon, even though she doesn't get sucked away by sea snakes. But she gets the no, don't bring the city in, and then they ignore her. The horse into the city, and then they ignore her. And ultimately she is taken with Agamemnon. She's taken by Agamemnon. And in the text, in the Oresteia and in Euripides' Orestes, she is taken to Argos or Mycenae, depending on the text, with Agamemnon, and she is a slave in his household until her death by Clytemnestra. And I think there were some hints to that there. The writers obviously sort of knew that they were going to go with that direction, but they didn't really do that. Then you have Helen, and in the accounts of the Aeneid, and in a few other accounts as well, again, if there are any more, pop them down below. By the time, and this will be a bit about Paris as well, by the time that the sack of the city of Troy happens in texts, Paris is already dead by this point. He has been either poisoned or died on the battlefield. There are accounts of Paris's death. But so he doesn't die during the sack of Troy. He dies earlier, and then by the time the sack of Troy happens, Helen is actually married, at least in the Aeneid, to Paris's and Hector's brother Deiphobus. Now Deiphobus is a character in the show, but he didn't really get much development. He was only sort of mentioned in the first episode, and then this episode, and then that's all we really saw as an audience. So in the myth, in the Aeneid as the text, she is married to Deiphobus, and then she ultimately betrays him during the sack of the city, and then goes with Menelaus willingly. Now obviously that's not what happened in this episode. I think they felt like, well, obviously I think it made sense for the show not to go that route, because that would have mean developing Deiphobus as a character, having Paris die, and then having her go with him, even though the entire premise of the episode from episode 1 was sort of the relationship between Paris and Helen, so it made sense for them to make Paris die during the sack of the city. In this instance, I had some problems with how they did Helen's character and how her role during the whole sack of the city, but that has nothing to do really with the text. That just has problems with the show. So going on to Andromache. Now, Andromache's story is changed by most texts, because including, again, this is described in the Aeneid, and it's in Andromache the Tragedy and Trojan Women. Andromache is taken by Neoptolemus or Pyrrhus, that's Achilles' son, to be his slave in the text, and typically sometimes it is Neoptolemus who kills Astyanax. I will talk more about Astyanax in a minute. Where she is taken as a slave by him, but as Neoptolemus isn't in this series, I mean, it wouldn't, with the way they framed Achilles, it wouldn't really have much sense that Achilles would have his son at Troy, or Neoptolemus would turn up after Achilles' death at Troy, so it makes some sense there. Why Neoptolemus isn't in the series. So obviously with him not there, they had to come up with a different thing for Andromache. So with Andromache, they decided to have her taken, it seems to be taken by Odysseus' forces. She might have gone with another Greek king, I don't know, maybe Menelaus or Agamemnon, but it seemed she was they closely tied her story in with Odysseus. Now, again, her story is mostly told during the fallout of, these various tragedies with the fallout, and the death of Astyanax is described there, is, the Trojan women, and Hecate probably touched on the most, and then Andromache is sort of discussing it after the fact. Now, honestly, I didn't think they would show the death of Astyanax. I genuinely didn't. I didn't think the BBC would show the murder of a child. Not even the murder of a child, the murder of a baby. I didn't think they would do that, and I was honestly shocked that they did. Now, I was very emotionally affected by it during the scene for multiple reasons. I mean, yeah, it's the death of a baby, but I've read about the death of the Steinacs for years, and I've had the you know, and obviously there's been this awful aching feeling when it's reading about, you know, a baby being thrown off a wall. That's awful. I mean, you know, different accounts of it, and in some accounts, I think in the Trojan Women, it's Odysseus who persuades the Greeks that they have to kill Astyanax, and he persuades, and he's the one who sort of takes the baby from Andromache, and he's sort of the one who returns the baby to Andromache. You know, I think it's Talthybius who actually returns the baby's body on a shield and then all cleaned up. So there's that sort of thing, and he, you know, and there's very few accounts of who actually threw the baby off the wall. Sometimes it's Neoptolemus because, you know, people do not like Pyrrhus, and sometimes it's, you know, Odysseus, which in the show, in the Troy Fall of City, the creators decided to go with Odysseus. Now, why I found the scene particularly, even though I knew it was coming, I said from the very first time they mentioned Andromache getting pregnant, I was like, oh, this baby's gonna die, it's gonna suck. And it did, and I sort of knew it was coming, but I didn't expect it, if that makes any sense. That might sound really stupid. For someone who knew it was coming and not expecting it, it's a bit weird, because there was quite a few fake outs, because first Odysseus finds Andromache, and then she's walking away, and then the baby cries, and then, you know, you don't know what's happening, and then you come out and you're like, oh no, they've left the baby, yeah, and then the baby cries again, and then he dies. And so there's these two fake outs, which I found unnecessary. I felt if you were just going to do it, then just sort of get on with it. Don't play with the audience like that. When, I mean, not everyone will know they're coming, not everyone's familiar with the myth, so I think it's probably a shock to a lot of people that this would happen, because even in something like Game of Thrones, I don't think they've actually shown a baby's death on screen. Maybe, I think there are some shows, but not any what I've seen recently. And it's just, what I felt the weakest point was with this is that they didn't, because as far as I'm concerned, most ancient heroes by modern standards are monstrous. They burn cities to the ground, and they rape women, and they kill children. And that's a thing that most heroes do, and I feel like when you read text, that's sort of a thing you get used to when you're studying classics. That's not to say that those actions are any less monstrous for a modern person, but when you read classics, you start to understand the cultural context of those actions when it comes to the precedent of ancient Greek male behaviour. There's a lot of anxiety about children and sons coming back to avenge their fathers. It happens when you go to war with people every summer. You have this culture of people dying in war and sons could come back, or, you know, you fear that your city will be sacked, or you have to sack someone else's city. So there is more of a context of why people feel that killing a baby would just be a thing that would happen. And I feel like they didn't do that. You know, because by ancient Greek standards, you know, the death of Astyanax has always been questionable. Most of the tragedies don't treat it very well. They always treat it with an air of uncomfortable horror about it. It's like, oh, you know, Greek soldiers murdered a baby, when we understand why, because the baby would be a threat to them eventually, but it's still sort of, you know, ethically ambiguous in sort of horrible way. But I feel to a modern audience, murdering a baby is just evil. There's not a lot of moral ambiguity when it comes to that point. It's just an evil thing to do. So when you're creating a show for a modern audience based off those ancient ethical ambiguities, which are by modern standards monstrous, and then not really include the full cultural context in the show and focus on why they're different, it just sort of comes across very horrible without much sense to it. I mean, fair play to the guy who plays Odysseus. You know, he looked uncomfortable doing it, and he tried to say that they shouldn't do it, but that doesn't make it any less of a an evil act, and I feel like this is at the main point where, yeah, in terms of a sequel series, for example, thanks to one of my lovely subscribers, Spanny Cat Waffles, thank you for that, linked down on another video down below to an article about the potential, the creators talking about the potential for a sequel series. They're either potentially going to do the Oresteia or the Odyssey. Now, I talked in the last episode about them maybe doing an Aeneid series. They don't seem to be doing that, but I feel like if you're doing an Odysseus series so far, Odysseus series, I don't feel like a modern audience is going to want to follow a man who has dropped a baby off some walls, because all of Odysseus's actions in the show so far have been in character for an ancient Odysseus. Now, I know Odysseus quite closely when it comes to modern interpretations of him. I actually did my undergraduate dissertation on the subject. I did Odysseus in pop culture. I talked about him in 3 movies, 2 books and 2 comic books. Yes, I did 3 comic books actually. Yeah, and so if the series had been out in 2015, you know, maybe my undergraduate dissertation would have been a little bit different. But you know, Odysseus goes through a lot of changes in ancient texts, because by archaic Greek standards, great. By classical Greek standards, oh, a little bit conflicting. By the time the Romans roll around, he's a straight up cartoon villain. And I feel like they sort of tried to do 2 different things, the creators, in Troy Fall of a City with him, because his actions seem to be portrayed in a way that the Romans would have maybe portrayed him, as they're horrific. He kills a baby, he causes the sack of Troy with the Trojan horse, he kills one of Achilles' men to trick him into fighting, he does this all, and even though the actor, he has this conflicted look on his face, he's sort of like, oh, I don't want to be doing this, you know, I just want to get home, but his actions are still morally reprehensible to a modern audience, so I feel like if you're trying to follow him into the Odyssey series, you're not really going to want to follow the man who has done all these things just because he looks conflicted about it. Again, in my opinion, Odysseus is always a bit of a, he's a bit of a dick, really. I don't think I should say that on my channel. But he has, you know, in the Odyssey, while the text interprets him very positively, you know, cunning Odysseus, you know, favoured by certain gods, not by others, it's sort of a complicated thing, and I think you can interpret the character in many different ways, but they've tried to do 2 different things here, and it just sort of hasn't really worked. Like, I don't think people would care enough about him to follow him through a sequel series. I mean, I would watch it because of the channel and because I can't not watch a thing with Odysseus in it, but again, guys, comment down below if you would watch an Odysseus series with this version of Odysseus. I can understand someone watching, you know, I think the movie Troy has many, many faults, and I'll talk about that eventually in a later video, but I think, you know, people would have wanted to watch a Sean Bean Odyssey movie, but maybe not this guy. I don't know, again, comment down below. And I think that's, and like with the Oresteia, I think if you were talking about Agamemnon in a similar thing, I feel like they've made Agamemnon so morally reprehensible, so just utterly unlikable, that any conflict that would actually come from an Oresteia series would be weakened a little bit. Because ultimately you're meant to sort of understand why Orestes and Electra would have loved their father and would have murdered their mother in revenge for his death, but in this one you just be like, well, no, he's just awful. So I feel like what the creators did by making the Greeks, by focusing it from the Trojan side and then potentially setting up sequel series with the Greeks, who have so far been the bad guys, which is quite unusual for an adaptation of ancient sources, because even in the Aeneid, which is very pro-Trojan, because again, the discussion on whether or not it's Augustan propaganda, and Augustus claimed to be descended from the Trojans via Aeneas and Julian and whatever, I'll go into that in a bit, that even they had a little bit less a harsh view on the Greeks. I feel like they've, other than maybe Achilles, and even then, the Greeks have just been not handled with a lot of ambiguity in terms of why they have to be there. They haven't really gone into what the Greeks are really getting out of sacking Troy, other than they're sort of just horrible people and they want to destroy a city. And again, if you have different interpretations, please pop it down below, because there's not enough of a cultural context for the behaviour of ancient Greek men to actually justify their behaviour, at least in the series. And maybe the creators thought that if they went into that cultural context, it would just alienate some audiences who maybe it would be too alien a society for them to see. But I feel like by having the actions that are justified by that behaviour, not justified, but explained by that behaviour without the cultural context explaining it, it just creates very unlikable people who you may not want to see following up in a sequel series. I mean, that's the sort of reason why I thought maybe they were going for a Aeneid sequel series, because it would make sense having a series focused on the Trojans and the Trojan royal family to carry on with the story of the Trojans through Aeneas. And initially, this is very naive of me, I initially thought that, oh, you know, initially when the baby Astyanax was initially left behind by Odysseus the first time, that what could happen was like, oh, okay, so they haven't got Julius, but maybe they're rewriting Trojan and Roman history a little bit by having Aeneas take the baby Astyanax, and then Astyanax would sort of be Julius, and then it would carry on that way because they haven't introduced Aeneas' son. So there's could be a reason there. No, the baby just died, and Aeneas was just a different bit of a character. So now with Aeneas, though, yeah, Aeneas. I thought, considering I've used the Aeneid as my text pretty much to base this episode on, I should probably talk about his survival during the sack of Troy. Now, again, in Book 2, Aeneas, and now keep in mind that Aeneas himself is the narrator of Book 2 of the Aeneid, so yeah, he might be making himself sound better than he was, but what he is doing, during the sack of the city, he tries to fight. He has lots of his men around him, the Dardanians, who are Trojans, and he's urged to leave the city by the gods, by the ghost of his dead wife Creüsa, who I mentioned in my last episode, to take his father Anchises and his son Julius and the idols of Troy, and to get them out, basically. So Aeneas and his group of men, again I will stress the group of men bit, leave Troy during the sack of the city. You know, he's actually looking behind him, looking at the burning city behind him, and he seems to feel quite a lot of guilt that he's leaving the city to its fate, really, because it's his God-given responsibility now to sort of revive the Trojans through the Roman line further down the road, and sort of to find a new home for the Trojans. So what happens in the show is Aeneas says goodbye to Paris, and then he hides among dead bodies, and then he just sort of waits around, and then he sort of leaves at the end, which I find sort of interesting, because again, while Book 2 of the Aeneid, it's from Aeneas's narration, it's from his perspective. You know, he is still described as this great warrior. He's leaving Troy for, you know, the sack of the city because he has a responsibility to people, and he is a leader, and he's strong, and he wouldn't have done it if the gods and his dead wife hadn't told him to, you know. So I feel like Aeneas from the Aeneid would not hide among bodies to spare himself. I don't really like that, so I think the BBC took a sort of interesting perspective on that one. I mean, maybe that would make sense of, you know, why people escaped, why people could do that, but it's not, I don't think there is a text where Aeneas is seen doing that. One thing, it's also him, two other characters who are not in any text, sort of these Trojan baker boys who survive with him, and then Briseis turns up. Briseis, I don't believe, has any other textual reference other than the Iliad. I might be very wrong on that, please pop it down below. So you have these four people, so you have Aeneas, two children, and Briseis, which is not exactly the Trojan battalion that, battalion's probably the wrong word, that Aeneas had with him to go on a ship and then found Rome and sort of fight a war with. So not many Trojans escape. So I don't know how the Trojan line to found Rome will come from these 4 people. So I feel like they're not going to be doing an Aeneid series, which is actually a shame. I'd be interested to see that, because I've seen the Odyssey, I've seen Troy a few times, I've never seen the Aeneid, so I would have been interested to see that, even though Roman stuff is not my forte, but still, it would have been interesting. But yeah, that's the text based for Troy Fall of a City. All the way from pre-Iliad stuff, throughout the Iliad, a couple of tragedies, and now the Aeneid a few times. Yeah, and I would be interested to see if I've missed anything out. So yeah, please pop your comments down below on your opinions of the series as a whole, if I've missed any texts out that you would have liked me to talk about. I will be doing probably about 2 more episodes on Troy Fall of a City, covering some topics which I didn't really have the chance to in terms of the episode recap, so just a few different things to do with the Iliad, and so again, it's just talk about them. And yeah, it's been an interesting show. I hope that there is a sequel series. I don't know if there will be, because I don't think people have actually reacted to the series very well. I don't know if they've had the ratings to justify a sequel series. I hope there is, because I would like to talk about it with you guys. But yeah, I will be back soon. I'm not going to say next week. The next couple of weeks are going to be a bit mad for me for a few reasons. But I will be back to you as soon as I can with another video on probably Troy Fall of a City and sort of battles, I think. I think I want to talk about some battles. So I will see you then. Okay, if you like this video, please like, share and subscribe, and I will see you soon. Bye guys!